recording. Excellent. Well, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our webcast to dig into forecasting data center energy demand. I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off because we have a lot to talk about in this webcast and only an hour to do it. So I'm really pleased to get us rolling. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Morgan Scott. I'm EPRI's Vice President of Global Outreach and Partnerships here, and really pleased to be able to be cruise directing us through today's conversation. So a couple of housekeeping notes up front. We are recording today's webcast so that those who may be registered but couldn't actually join can access the recording. So your participation in today's webcast provides your consent to that recording. We also encourage you to ask questions to our panelists, to our speakers today. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see a chat bubble. If you open up that chat bubble, that will give you the opportunity either to pose your question or share your comment to everyone, or you can go ahead and select my name and message me directly, and I can incorporate that on your behalf. Also, to help with access to today's conversation, we have enabled closed captioning. So if that helps you to participate, please see in the bottom left-hand corner of the WebEx screen the closed captioning button. You can click that and that will pull a transcript for you. With that, just a couple of upfront notes from me. As I noted, we have a great turnout today, and I wanted to kind of start this conversation by recognizing the real diversity of organizations that are on the line today. We have over 400 people registered for nearly 200 organizations, which I think really demonstrates the importance of both this topic and the interest that we really have from a wide variety of perspectives. So thank you to everyone that has come to join, to be a part of this conversation. And I really want to underscore that this is intended to be the start of the conversation. This is the first kind of large public webcast that we've hosted from DCFlex. DCFlex is an initiative that my colleague David Larson will speak more to, but it was launched last November, so it's been about a year and really intended to explore how can we think about data centers less as a grid risk and more as a grid resource through flexibility. And load forecasting is certainly a part of that conversation and a focus work stream of that work. But with that in mind, this first webcast provides the foundation for continued engagement. We are getting ready to launch the DCFlex Forum, which is an opportunity for organizations that might not be members of DCFlex, but have a vested interest in this, regulatory organizations, academia, etc. If you're interested in learning more and getting involved in the DCFlex effort, this is how you do it. So after this webcast, or even right now, you can send an email to dcflexforum@epri.com. We will add you to our communications list. And we're looking forward to all of the ways kicking off in 2026 that we will be able to engage with you and keep you informed about the really important work that we're doing here through DCFlex. So with that, I will let you know what the agenda of today's plan is. So we are going to open up with my colleague David Larson, who leads the workstream focus on load forecasting. He's going to give you some insights into what that actually means and looks like through DCFlex and some of our initial learnings that we've developed over the past year. So that will bring you up to speed with some of the technical input that we're learning through DCFlex, but then we wanted to bring it into the real world. So we have a really great panel lineup set for you so that we can explore what does this really mean to a regulator, to a forecaster when you're a utility? How do we really think about forecasting for large load growth and particularly data centers in the real world? So looking forward to being able to facilitate that, but first I'm going to introduce my colleague, David Larson, and I'm going to let him take over from here and bring us up to speed with all of the technical work. So without further ado, David, looking forward to learning from you.
Great, yeah, thank you, Morgan. Excited to be here and talk to all of you folks. We've put together some content to go over some key points, and then we'll have some time before we move to the panel discussion for questions and answers. So if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and when we get to that point, we can address them. But today, trying to share some learnings and get some good information out there. So quick Background on DCFlex, as Morgan mentioned, this is a large effort being spearheaded by EPRI, but it's bringing together all different types of stakeholders. We have everyone from the utilities and the ISOs that EPRI does traditionally work with, as well as the folks that are on the data center side, the developers, the hyperscalers, etc. And so we've got a great group and really trying to solve these shared challenges. I'll mention a couple of things about this. One thing is we've got 4 work streams. And actually, there's a little bit of, okay, yeah. We've got 4 work streams. These are covering all the different attributes that we're seeing as, sorry, there's some background noise if I'm not sure. I'll just keep going. So workstream 1, we're really focusing there about how do you make the data centers themselves flexible? What does that require? And thinking about different approaches for that. And again, making sure we're getting that input both from what the utility side need for flexibility to inform that, as well as the folks building and operating the data centers. Workstream 2 is all about once the data centers are flexible, how do you actually integrate them into your programs? How would you interface with them? What are all those pieces to actually put this into practice? Workstream 3 is focused about how do you do all the planning applications to account for that flexibility and overall just addressing the challenges in the planning timescale. And then our last work stream is all about the energy supply side of how do you actually meet this demand in a way that makes sense, that deals with all the technical challenges involved, and trying to, again, equip everyone with the tools needed. A big thing I'll mention here is we're trying to get all this stuff, and a big emphasis of DCFlex is putting it into practice. And one big area of that is our demonstration projects, which you may have seen on the news and different media releases about actually putting this into practice, having data centers demonstrate flexibility, giving us benchmarking and a lot of great insights. And so there have been 3 that have been talked publicly so far, and there's many more that are in progress that we're expanding. But suffice to say, there's lots of great work happening in DCFlex. And you can go to our website, dcflex.epri.com, if you want to learn more. But today is about forecasting. This just gives you some context. So next up, I do want to mention, just reiterating that point, DCFlex has got a lot of different people involved, and it's great because we need everyone's voices to come together on these shared challenges. And so you see here, we've got everything from the folks building the data centers, operating them. We also have the ISOs, the utilities, but also folks like technology providers and others that are helping enable this flexibility in practice. So it's a great group. It's also continuing to expand. This is just to give you a little bit of a flavor of we've got a lot of great people involved, and we're very proud of that. Last thing I'll mention before I dive in all the details, we've got a great team. I'm just one of the folks working on DCFlex. It's a great team, and this is actually just our core team. We've got lots of great people at EPRI, as well as with all of our partners working on this. But just to suffice to say, we've got a great team on this, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this through things like the DCFlex forum that Morgan had mentioned. So let's talk forecasting. The work on forecasting is happening under workstream 3 of DCFlex. That's the one about grid planning for operational flexibility. And I will note at this time when we talk about forecasting, we're focusing on the planning timescales, things like a year plus out for all that topic. That's the current focus, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But also our emphasis is on we want to improve the methods and equip our members with the things they need to improve their forecasts. So we're not trying to come out and just be another data source for putting out forecasts. We're trying to equip people with the tools and data and guidance so that they can improve their forecasts, which then improves all of the things downstream from that. That does include things that are also essential for forecasting, like load shapes. We won't get into that today, but collecting data about how the data centers are operating and giving that to our members is a big aspect of this. Again, we're trying to focus on what do people need, get this into practice, equip them with what is required to make these improvements. As we talk about forecasting, there's different sources of uncertainty. I'll mention kind of where I put the three big categories. One is some data center projects will not materialize. Projects that are going into the queue, not every project is going to be built. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It could be something changes with the company trying to build it and they decide that data center isn't available. It could be things like there are delays with something that make a project not viable. It could be just, usage changes or technology changes. So there's a variety of reasons that mean not every project is going to end up on the grid. And so any forecast needs to account for that. But there's two other big areas that come up as well. The first one is a major part, but the second one, these data centers, when they get connected, on day one, their actual usage doesn't go to 100%. It takes time to construct all the facilities. It takes time to get all the hardware installed and tested. And so it can take months or years for the load to ramp up to its nominal amount. And that sort of timing is something to consider in a forecast. Because if you ignore that, you might be having a forecast that is giving you an overestimation of the load actually hitting a system. And we want to try to go towards what equips us with the best information we have. The third piece, and this is probably not news to a lot of folks on this call, but it's worth reiterating, actual demand or energy usage from a data center is different than the contracted capacity from the grid. There are multiple reasons for this. A lot of it is things like just engineering best practices of you don't want to have a system running at its limit all the time. You want to have some buffer if you need to do maintenance or things happen. But regardless of the reason, the point is what's requested in capacity doesn't always translate to the actual energy usage. And that again is something important to factor in a forecast if your goal is to get the most accurate prediction. Now, there are other sources of uncertainty and other things that are important for forecasting, but I just want to highlight this as some context of how we've been thinking about it. So let's talk about what we've done. We've been doing a lot of work on this year. I'll mention this first big chunk of it in DCFlex is about providing a framework that practitioners can adopt. That's the goal. And this one has been focused on how do you make predictions of data center load on a regional basis or within kind of an entire system? What is the aggregate load that's going to come into a specific utility? That's the objective. A big part of this that has informed our working is many regions are seeing large amounts of growth, but they don't have a long history of existing data centers within their territory, or the types of data centers they've dealt with in the past are different than the ones they're seeing now. They may be seeing larger projects that are going to hundreds or thousands of megawatts. There may be different usage that they might be going towards AI applications and questions about what that may affect in terms of the forecasts. But the point being is that for many folks, simply relying on history is not sufficient. So we went after what is something people can put in practice now that they would have access to. And so the direction we've gone is let's leverage what's in the interconnection requests to inform the forecasts. And I'll show some examples of this later, but that's sort of one of the core themes is what is available now that we can use to try to improve the forecast and ultimately improve the outcomes. I will say the full details of this framework are only available currently to DCFlex members. Today, I'm going to give you sort of a high level view, but I'm not going to be able to share all of the details. But I think today you'll get a good sense of what we're trying to do. And if you are a member of DCFlex or you're interested in becoming a member, this is an example of something that you would have access to. So high level, how does this work? And again, I'm doing this purposely at high level. I'm not getting all the details because I just want to get across the main points, and we can always have some Q&A after I finish. As I said, we're focused on using load interconnection data. And the idea is that is something that is available to utilities and ISOs. This is readily available, and we informed our method based on what is included generally in those interconnection requests. The way we took it is you take those requests and we apply what we're calling a risk adjustment. You say there are reasons to think that certain projects maybe have more or less uncertainty based on, for example, how far along they are in the process. If they're a brand new application, there's maybe more uncertainty than if someone's already done an engineering study or someone is already in the contracting phase, for example. And none of this is based on actual judgments of how these projects should be treated for planning. This is just based purely on if you need to make a forecast, this is how we're trying to capture that piece of not every project that has applied is going to materialize. From there, then the part of let's actually factor in the fact that the actual load can be different than capacity and it can take time to ramp up. That is just basically physical constraints of how quickly this load can actually appear once it's got its service start. And at the end, we aggregate that together. So again, I'm purposely explaining this in a very simple way. There's lots of details that matter a lot in this, but this is an approach that we feel makes sense, is also something that is implementable by folks and can be explained and refined over time. We do intend to improve this and make adjustments and refinements based on feedback from our DCFlex members, but this is at a high level the approach that we're going for at the moment. So let's give an example of this. I'm going to show an example for New York State. I'm showing this purposely because they are one of the few areas that have public load interconnection data. As in, you can go to the New York ISO website and download an Excel file that has the current interconnection queue. And therefore, in theory, you could do what I'm going to explain to you next. As of September, there's around 30 projects in the queue. These vary in size. The largest one, again, at that time was around 1,000 megawatts requested, but the typical project was in the like 50 to 300 range. Now, traditionally, even a 50 megawatt project was pretty large, but as we're seeing more hundreds or even thousands of megawatt size projects, those are still showing up, but we're just seeing larger projects in terms of capacity. Now, when you add this up, that's about 6 gigawatts of requested capacity. If you said all of these projects happen to succeed, they all came online, that's adding about 6 gigawatts. For context, that's around 19% relative to the New York ISO's current peak load of 32 gigawatts. So just to give you a scale of, for this region, this is kind of the size you're seeing. And the plot on the right is just a nice visual of where these projects are applying for and some relative context about where transmission lines are. And there are lots of reasons for where these are being located. We're just saying, this is what's being requested. Let's use that information. Quick context, and this is something you can look at as well yourself. The date of application versus the requested start date. This is more just to give some context. If you take those requests, you can see a couple of things, at least that I'll point out. One is there is more requests coming in recent years, particularly in response to things like ChatGPT coming out and the growth in AI. You are seeing more projects enter the queue compared to in the past. But the start date and how long between folks are applying to the service date varies quite a bit. Now, these are the requested start dates. It doesn't mean they're going to happen. For example, there's at least a couple of projects requesting service start within a year of applying. Not sure if that's realistic. It may happen, it may not. But you also have some other projects putting in requests many years ahead. There's one on here that was put in 2024 requesting a service start in 2031. So these vary. There's lots of different types of data centers in this queue, but the idea is this gives you a sense of what is being requested currently in New York. So let's look at what this results in using our method. I didn't want to quote exact numbers here for a couple of different reasons. I just want to sort of illustrate what these different factors can do in our framework. So if you take what's requested and you say, I fully believe everything requested is going to materialize exactly when it says and for the amount it says, that first line shows you what that sort of load growth looks like over the next few years. It does flatten out because, like we said, most projects are not requesting 5+ years in advance. And so that's why it flattens out currently. The actual load may grow more than that. This is just what is currently in the queue. If we consider load ramping, as I mentioned, this is an important consideration. This is an example of what that load growth could then look like when you factor in load ramping, where it takes time for the actual energy demand to materialize. Folks are constructing things, they're putting in hardware, it doesn't happen overnight. So you can see this more gradual growth, still reaching the same final amount, but it can take more time for getting the actual full demand. Now, if you just apply the risk adjustment capacity, and there is some adjustment here that you can have different criteria, and this is an area that we're continually refining, but this gives you an example of if you ignore load ramping and you only say, let's try to factor in the uncertainty of not every project in the queue is going to end up being connected for one reason or another. This is an example of what that may look like. Now, ultimately, you would want to apply both of these. And this is, again, an example of what the load growth can look like. This is not meant to be, this is 100% the right answer. No forecast is perfect, and things as more information is given, and there's some information that, for example, we don't have access to for New York State that could help further refine this, that folks like the New York ISO do. But this gives you a sense of how this works and what the outcome can look like for applying this methodology that we've been developing. Again, there are many things we can refine, and we're trying to build this out and find those areas that are still gaps, get better data, just continually help everyone out. That's the goal. This is here's what we are to date, and then we're going to continue going further because this is just a shared challenge, and we want to continuously make improvements. So I went through that a bit quick, but that's on purpose because I want to leave some time for questions before we get to the panel. So I'm going to put up the slide here, and we'll check if there are questions in the chat. If folks want to ask questions, maybe they can raise their hand just to help sort of make things run smoothly. But we've got about, I'd say, Morgan, 10 minutes or so if we've got some Q&A. So yeah.
We do. And I see one that I see a hand raised, but maybe I'll ask the hard first question, David, which is super unfair. But I think I'm sitting here, and I imagine others are sitting at their computers as well, thinking, okay, this risk-adjusted capacity. I completely recognize that we're still kind of refining the methodology, but can you just give us like a little bit more there about like what might I be thinking about? What do I actually do? That seems like the secret sauce. Maybe I'm wrong. But tell us a little bit more about how you get to that.
Yes. So the approach we went for at the moment, again, with a focus on we want things that are practical, that people can take and they can put into practice and use them and benefit from them. So our general approach is somewhat like a scorecard in that you say for each project you go through and you might have a checklist and you say things like, well, does the project already have the land purchased? Do they already have permits? Have they already applied or have they started an engineering study with the utility? Those might be factors that imply there's more certainty about this project. It doesn't mean projects that haven't done that aren't going to succeed, but you're just sort of narrowing in to say we feel more confident about this subset. And there can be other things like, well, did they pick a site and is there transmission capacity? Because if there isn't, that might be an influence to say it's going to take multiple years to get more capacity there. And so you don't think that project can be built at the time. So that's a little bit of a flavor of how it is. I
Yeah.
will say we are looking to expand this and refine it as we get more data. We are also looking at things that are more of a stochastic approach because one area is thinking, well, that sort of rubric might change between regions. And so, is there maybe a more general way to do it that still gives you a good result, but just makes it a little bit easier than I have to really spend many years refining this sort of single rubric.
Yeah, appreciate that. Question in the queue from Thank You, and then I'll go to the chat question I saw come in.
Yeah.
Hey, David. Very interesting question. Sorry,
Mhm.
presentation. I have a few questions actually. So you mentioned that in the first stage you look at the application queue, right? The
Mhm.
application. So your forecast only include the the capacity that already appeared in the application queue, or it's also include the future that has not been recorded in the application queue yet.
Yeah, so our method is focused on kind of the out to 5, maybe 7 years based on current trends of how long it takes for projects to come online and ramp up. We've made the choice currently not to include a piece that is more about what is the other load growth that could appear that isn't yet in the queue. That's been informed by different feedback we've received and some technical discussions. There are some utilities today who make a consideration for projects that haven't entered the queue. And there are also others on the other side that say, we don't consider anything until they've signed a contract or
Mm-hmm.
some sort of much further along in the process. And we're kind of picking the middle ground of things that have at least applied, but with some consideration that not everything that's applied has actually going to materialize.
I see. That totally makes sense. And
Mhm.
you predict the location of the data center, or
So in this framework, we assume that we know the location that people have
okay.
applied for a specific spot. We do have some other work in DCFlex around the problem of if you forecast at the system or aggregate level, how
Mm,
can you maybe better predict down where exactly future data centers will show up that aren't in your application queue yet?
I see.
So that's another area under DCFlex, but don't have time today to go into it.
I see. Last question. Sorry, too many. Very
It's
interesting
okay.
topic.
Yeah.
So, do you have like a historical data to validate, the prediction? And also, like, how accurate do you think the prediction should be? Because for the planning purpose, you might not need like a super precise prediction, right? Maybe 20 plus, that kind of range is allowable. So do you have any insight on that? Thank you.
So yeah, great. That's definitely something we're thinking about. Validation is a big area. We are working with our partners to get more data and do case studies so we can show this. Though we recognize at the same time, validation against history doesn't mean it's going to be a good result in the future. But those are things that we are thinking actively about and trying to work with our different stakeholders, which the great part is we've got utilities, we've got ISOs, and we have the data center folks and the technology providers. So we're feeling confident we've got the right people in the room.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
And
but
accuracy.
appreciate the question. Yes,
Sorry.
yes. And the accuracy part, I think my general trend, as we discuss a lot with folks, is we do want accurate forecasts, but we honestly care more about having better outcomes. And so we're never going to have a perfect forecast, but that's a piece too that we're working more generally in DCFlex is inform those things to say, does the result change that much if you're 1% off or 2%? And that might depend on the application. And then we're trying to share those learnings back to say, this is what it means. And particularly questions around what data do you need and how much do you need to change your methods? But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So David, we have a question in the queue. So you
Yeah.
showed in your curves kind of different ways that demand might come down into
Yes.
a different number that's more realistic. But then the question is really, what are the unforeseen factors that could actually increase the load? Any line of sight to that?
Yeah, so some of it is there are some maybe construction or engineering practices that are enabling some sites to grow faster. That's one part that could grow in certain areas. There's also consideration DCFlex more generally about flexibility and how that may not increase the peak load on the system, but it may have some influence about the energy. There's also the potential of some things can change very rapidly in this space. We have examples of certain regions having available capacity and a lot of data centers then going all at the same time there because capacity is really the big consideration. And so, and maybe just the last point is, as we talk to folks on the data center side, it's very clear some projects are going to be hyper specific in location. They have to be within X miles of downtown Atlanta, for example. Other projects might say, hey, anywhere in the Southeast is good with us. And so that is another factor that you may have things moving more rapidly depending on the type of project. But those are a few examples.
Super helpful. And we got another question in the queue here around, do you also work on forecasting how dynamic this load could be during the day? And if so, could you give us some examples and speak to that?
Yeah, so that's another big area. Today, we're just focusing on more the planning side. I mentioned load shapes, and so it's been great working with our partners to understand how do these loads actually behave and what is driving their hour-to-hour variability or seasonal effects. That is a big area we're working on. I don't have time today to get into it, but one thing I'll just make the point on is, as you talk about data centers, not every data center is the same. And we're increasingly seeing that some of the more traditional categories don't tell you enough. So, for example, you can have two data centers that are both 100 megawatts that are both co-location facilities. And based on the workloads running within those data centers, they have very different load behaviors, also load factors, capacity factors, et cetera. And so it's not enough to just say, oh, it's a hyperscale data center, they're all the same. We're finding some of these additional points that are more important and then sharing that with our members to say, hey, watch for this, collect this data, this is what can happen. And we're also doing work on those short-term like day ahead forecasting, which don't have time for today, but that's another big area that EPRI is working on.
Yeah, that's excellent. I have a hand raised. I see several questions coming into the queue. We're going to end up having you answer those in the actual chat. But let's let our friend at Argonne National Lab, Kumar, he has a hand raised and he'll get the final question.
Hi, this is Kumar Jalla from Argonne National Lab. So many of these data centers, we know they're also co-generation. So they're co-locating different type of generation. How do we account for that? Do you rely on those generation?
It's a great question. I think it points to a more fundamental question, which is, and also on the topic of flexibility, there are considerations to say you want a forecast to be based on only the load side, and that if there is generation, that is a consideration in other parts, not in the forecast. But there is some argument to say, well, if it is going to be always affecting the net load, you should capture it. I don't think there's a consensus yet. I think the distinction that comes up a lot is if there's co-located generation, if that's like for backup or just for a few times a year, maybe you don't want that in your load forecast. You want the load forecast to be a bit more of an upper bound. But there could be application where you say, no, this is regularly affecting the load. It is important. One related thing is this has been focused on things like basically peak load. We are doing a lot of work about the more time granularity to say, okay, I have the peak load, but what happens in the winter? And maybe you're more concerned about that for your forecast. So that's another area we're working on, but don't have the results or time today to show them. But appreciate the question.
Quick follow-up, like, does the storage account for that? Because storage will impact your peak load, right?
So storage can, I think, it's sort of a more fundamental question, and you see this with like hybrid resources of if it's solar and a battery and operating. Do you forecast the solar and battery separately? Do you put them together? Right now, we're trying to understand those impacts rather than recommending one way or the other. But yes, that could be a factor. There's not a conclusion yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
Well,
Morgan,
David,
I'll
yeah.
respond in the chat to other questions, but back to you.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. David, thank you so much. I think that was a really nice introduction, and I know that there's still a lot more to go in terms of figuring out this conundrum of load forecasting for data centers, but I'm so glad that you were able to give everyone at least the first touch of what we've been doing and where we're headed, and appreciate folks can keep dropping their questions into the queue so that they can continue the conversation with you while we jump into the panel. So David gave us some line of sight into how are we thinking about this from a theoretical and technical perspective here at EPRI through DCFlex. Now let's jump into a conversation about what does this really mean in the real world. We are incredibly lucky to have 3 panelists to join me here to have this conversation. Judge Jamal Hudson is a commissioner at the Virginia State Corporation Commission, and I must also say he is a part of EPRI's advisory council, so incredibly grateful for him to join us and provide some of that regulatory perspective. And then Jed and Rejo are from the company utility side. They're members of DCFlex and able to provide us some real life perspective from forecasters and people that are really thinking about how to actually plan and prepare for the grid of the future in consideration of these large loads and data centers. So I'm going to jump right into it with our 3 panelists. It's open game. I want to start with reactions to what David said, right? So David gave us some line of sight into how we're thinking about load forecasting and what needs to happen here for data centers. What do you think? What are your reactions? I mean, are you excited? Do you wish you had seen more? Does it resonate? Judge Hudson, I'll start with you and see what you have to say.
Sure. No, thank you, Morgan. I think from my vantage point as a state commissioner and someone who is a leader in NARU, what really resonated with me was basically 3 things. One, I heard a questioner talk about this a little bit earlier, about the focus on uncertainty and ranges. I think for us, as a state regulator, it's really good to embrace the scenarios and probabilities. I'm quickly learning that when it comes to data centers and artificial intelligence and large loads, it's not really a straight line. You really have to look at a fan of possibilities. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that while we all focus on the peak numbers and how does that look, I think a little bit more, and again we're seeing this in Virginia, we kind of need to know where and when that load is going to show up. And I think that's something that's going to be really important as we are trying to do a lot of upgrades, because we have to do this in real life, and that's going to be really key. I think the third point, and again, I heard this early in the conversation about forecasting. I think forecasting is going to be so key in planning decisions. A lot of evidentiary hearings, not an academic exercise. I mean, it really helps us with the resource plans. It helps us with the interconnection. Most importantly, as a regulator, it helps us with risk management. I would say over time, what's going to be really helpful for me is just learning more about some of the misses, things that we can actually improve on with And again, I think more visibility with the assumption in AI adoption, regulators. So we're looking at customer behavior is really. I think all of those are pretty much like building blocks. So, but I think overall what David has done is really great, and I think it's going to help us with wrestling a lot of the challenges that we're going to be facing in the future.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Jed, I'm curious what your reactions to what David shared are, and also give us some perspective. You're a forecaster. This is your day-to-day life. Anything that you would share in terms of what you're learning in Arizona, which is also a hot spot, pun intended, for data centers. So anything you would share with folks on the line from your perspective?
Yeah, it is a hot spot, but we're actually in a cold spell right now, so I'm trying to stay warm. Maybe avoid the golf trip out here for a week or so. But no, I think it's really exciting. So I appreciate David's conversation there and him presenting that to a larger group. Here in Phoenix, we've been forecasting large customers separately for many years, and these methods have really evolved and I think improved substantially over that time. And a big part of that has been kind of bilateral exchanges with other utilities and others in the data center industry to help us really learn more about the space. So having EPRI come in and DCFlex come in and take that moderation role with that incredible consortium that David shared that we have in DCFlex really kind of supercharged that effort from my perspective. So we were really able to learn more about the space and more quickly what other utilities are doing, and also how data centers themselves forecast their power demands and what they know and what sometimes they don't know. And so I really find those best practices that David shared to be really helpful, because now as a group, we have something to point to as an industry standard and a starting point for data center forecasting. And that's a positive step forward for me.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Rayjo, I'm curious, you're in a similar vein. You work for a utility. You are focused on the strategic grid planning and forecasting. How are you thinking about this particular question for Portland General, and then reactions to what David shared in terms of what you actually do in real life?
Sure. Thank you, Morgan. Yeah, I completely agree with Jed that this is an important effort. This is a challenge for the utility industry. As a grid planner, we want to know and right-size the investments for our customers in the right time and be able to provide the capacity that the customers need. Challenges are abound, and I appreciate EPRI DCFlex taking on this challenge. And one thing that resonates with me on what David said is kind of the realization of these loads, right? We have customers that are connected and growing. We have prospective customers that want to connect. I think we have to address the forecasting from both sides, especially for the customers that are connected. We have some challenges in understanding the nature of their load ramp. Customers provide us load ramp. In some cases, they meet the load ramp. Some cases, they lag depending on the tenants that they may have. It'll be nice to understand what the tenant behavior is. It's something that's we're trying to understand from our customers too. It'll be nice to get that input as a collaborative effort here in DCFlex.
Yeah, excellent. And maybe we'll come back to that towards the end of our conversation. There was a question that came up as David was presenting, and the answer here was a little bit of there's no perfect forecast, right? But I guess I'd love to hear, and maybe Rayjo, I'll start with you. What's the risk of getting a forecast wrong? And what do you do in your role to actually mitigate for that risk?
Yeah, the risk of getting a forecast wrong means we are not either meeting the customer load or the customer expectations, or we are oversizing our infrastructure. And we may have stranded assets, right? We don't want both. We want to right-size the infrastructure. I would say one of the things that we've been doing in Oregon and with our state PUC is we went through a docket and kind of formalized the process of the large load intake. And we formalized the study process. We're trying to take them through a structured process where we end up with an interconnection agreement. That way we can kind of know who's serious, who's willing to move forward with us and put the right investments help us put the right investments in place to meet their demand. That's one way to kind of maybe put certainty to the uncertain forecasting challenge that we have.
Yeah, perfect. Ted, anything you would add there from your perspective, or anything you do differently from SRP?
Yeah, and I largely agree with Reho. You know, there's major risks on both sides. If these forecasts are too low, there's operational risks, challenges with reliability potentially. Forecasts are too high, systems overbuilt, there can be financial risks, affordability impacts to other classes. So, I mean, the stakes are high here, to be candid. So what we do is we do a number of scenario forecasts every year and sensitivities that look at different feasible futures that could occur if these data centers maybe move more or less quickly than we're assuming in a base planning case. And then we really work with our various planning teams to understand those different risks and how they're exposed to those different risks, and then think really carefully through risk mitigation. So understanding that these are risks to the enterprise, we can quantify these risks, and then we can try to share these risks appropriately with the large load customers. I think that's a major part of the conversation in this epoch of large load growth. And it's a spot where forecasts can certainly help to show how futures could reasonably progress and diverge from what we maybe expect. But we need to make sure the enterprises are all using this information.
Yeah, super helpful. And Ted Hudson, I wonder if you could provide us some perspective from the regulator, right? So we've heard if you're too low, it's a problem. If you're too high, it's a problem when you're stranded assets. I mean, for a regulator needing to protect the customer and keep rates affordable, what does that mean and look like to you? Any thoughts here?
No, absolutely, Morgan. I think you hit it spot on. I think from my seat, being wrong in either direction, it's just costly. And you know, you can look at it in different ways. Again, if you forecast too high, you risk overbuilding generation and transmission. This can lead to stranded or underutilized assets, and those costs don't vanish. They show up in customers' bills, and you can also end up locking in resources and technologies optimal as the landscape actually changes and evolves. If this is too low, you are running the risk of liability and resilience. That can lead to shortages, emergency procurements, and greater dependence on imports. Maybe actually worse for affordability than prudent early investments that we've done. Also risk jeopardizing the very economic development that you're trying to support. Discussions about how to mitigate the risk. First is definitely scenario-based regulation, looking at many different opportunities and features of, and asking utilities to propose many different situations and come up with different ways of outcomes, not just the central case. Another thing is maybe phasing approvals and checkpoints.
I think
Also,
I might have. There we go. You're back.
Oh,
I
can you
lost
hear
your
me? My
voice a little
apologies.
bit. Yeah, there you
I
go.
was having some, yes, internet connection issues. My apologies. I'll just finish up and just say, you know, having some regular updates, frequent updates hard when it comes to the forecasting. And I think the last piece is just, you know, having opportunities to not actually be siloed. And if you're in a state that's in an RTO, having the RTO would also have other independent analysis as well. And so I think the real challenge is, you know, you want to make sure that you have a grid that's very resilient. The design is actually in place, and
Yeah. Okay. I have a question, Jen. I want to pull on something that you said earlier, kind of around the bilateral exchanges between companies and developers. And maybe the question is a bigger one. And are there ways that we can enhance this transparency and the sharing of knowledge between utilities, regulators, developers, everyone that has a hand in this conversation? I'd be curious. I hear in a lot of different places. I'm speaking on a lot of panels. I'm in a lot of different rooms on this, and I hear a lot about we need more transparency. that's not really easy in this particular conversation. So I'm curious, from your experience at SRP and some of your comments, what would you say there? Is there something we can do to enhance this transparency and this line of communication?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I do think collaboration can help a lot. And we do have good relationships with developers and customers, and so there's a good exchange going on at the micro level. I think activities like this help, and the more utilities understand about data center operations and business models, the better we can help to prepare the power system to serve those needs. There is one thing that sticks out to me as particularly challenging, and this has come up a couple times in DCFlex, which is there's kind of a disconnect between the co-location data center business model and how utilities plan the power system. In that a co-location company is really a developer and a landlord, and in many cases they want to offer their customers, their end users of those space, flexibility and power usage, and really just ensure that power is there. But a lot of times the person that the utility company is talking to doesn't necessarily know what the data halls are ultimately going to be used for and when they will be put to use. So kind of some of that ramping behavior that David was talking about. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the timing and sometimes the magnitude of co-location data center power usage that the utility has to navigate through. And so I think, as we, as an industry, we start setting up additional incentives, communication checkpoints, and contracts, these things can start to flow through the power interconnection process. And I think we'll see them start to impact that co-location business model to some extent, and how that interaction goes with the end use customer and the feedback to utility planning. So I think that's in the next couple of years, kind of collaboration for all of us here.
Yeah, really appreciate that. And I imagine your co-panelists have some similar thoughts. I want to move on, though. We've talked a lot about how do we power AI. At EPRI, we also talk a lot through our Open Power AI initiative around how does AI empower the energy sector, right? How do we actually use AI to fix these problems? And so I'm curious, and Rejo, maybe I'll start with you. Any perspective, or are you at Portland General giving any thought to AI applications to deal with forecasting and address some of these large load questions?
Yeah, again, my background is in system planning. Forecasting is an input that we use. But recently we have been exploring the idea of flexible interconnection, right? These data center customers, someone mentioned earlier that they come with a lot of backup generation. The question that we're exploring is how can we leverage that to accelerate the ramps while we are building the infrastructure to meet our reliability performance standards. Recently, we were exploring an area in the study process. Again, it's a complex study process. We ended up doing an 8760 analysis. We used the capabilities of AI to produce an 8760 forecast with the historic data that we have, correlation with temperatures on how the data center load behaves, to kind of extract the incremental hosting capacity we could leverage to meet some of the grid constraints. So yeah, we are exploring AI to solve some of the challenging, complex computational problems, including we're exploring, acceleration of power system studies. There are vendors and startups out there who are kind of exploring how can we, compute a lot of scenarios, especially with the transmission planning. There's a lot of scenarios and contingencies that you need to address before you authorize somebody to connect and ramp. So how can we make it faster? We are exploring in those arenas.
Yeah, that's great. And I've really enjoyed hearing Maria and Larry and some of the other Portland General folks share about what you all have been doing. Jed, curious from your perspective, similar kind of perspectives there at SRP. How are you using AI to tackle this challenge?
Yeah, so I'm on the forecasting and load research team, so we're a lot of kind of nerdy technologists to begin with. So, we're happy to find ways to use ChatGPT and generative AI as much as we can for everyday efficiency gains. Most of us are statisticians as well. So kind of as Rejo was talking about, there's machine learning and neural networks tools that have been available to statisticians for a long time. And so we use those. I will say kind of in the current conversation, those tools are typically very data hungry. So kind of the strategic planning forecasting that David was talking about, where you might not have a lot of data, or you're looking at something that's still purely hypothetical in the future. You might not have the data needed to fully train like a neural network. I think when it comes to generative AI and kind of the breakthrough of ChatGPT, there are some promising applications for forecasting. There's this transformer time series model, which is really a neural network that's based on the ChatGPT architecture. So that's something that we're excited to look into. But again, not sure it's going to help with the strategic forecasting task, but definitely kind of the everyday big data forecasting task, it's shown to be helpful with.
Yeah, super helpful. I'm going to ask the lightning round closing question to each of you, and then I'll let you jump into the chat. There have been some questions that have been coming in throughout our panel, and so I want to give you a chance to address them based on sort of what you see as a good place for you to add your vantage point. But in one sentence, when you think about what's next, right? So David still has 3 more years to think about load forecasting for data centers and what comes out of DCFlex. Ted, I'll start with you. What do you want to see? What's next for you that would be really impactful for what you do that we could do in DCFlex?
Yeah, I think it's just continued refinement of the industry standard, and continually hosting conversations like this is going to be most helpful.
Awesome. Ray-Jo, anything to add there from your perspective? What are you looking for from DCFlex?
I'm looking forward to the flexibility framework that you guys are developing. I know it's not directly related to forecasting, but it helps with the overall problem that we're trying to solve as a group.
Excellent. And last but most certainly not least, Judge Hudson, really want to hear from you about your thoughts from a regulator perspective. You're not participating in DCFlex, but certainly impacts what's going on in your state. What would you like us to be doing to help the members of DCFlex really address this challenge around forecasting for data centers?
Sure. Well, I'll say on behalf of all state regulators, I think there's 4 quick things I'll just say very quickly. I think one is definitely standardized large load forecasting frameworks. I think regional case studies, including the misses, there's always a lot of lessons to be learned. Distribution level forecasting tools, and most importantly, modules from regulators. We're always trying to learn, and I think any type of guidance that we get that falls in those 4 categories will be extremely helpful.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the 3 of you for joining us for that quick panel discussion, but I really think it's valuable to put this into context and really think about from that real world perspective. What are we doing here through DCFlex, and what does this mean when you're actually a company or actually a regulator or actually an industry stakeholder that is trying to navigate this really difficult question? So thank you for providing that perspective. I want to take the last few minutes of our time together to really thank David Larson as well for presenting the work that's been happening in DCFlex. I also want to recognize he provided the panel slide, or I should say the team slide of who is contributing from EPRI to DCFlex. But I know Anuja's on the line. She has been an incredible lead for this work, and I know several other members of the team are on the line as well. So just want to really say some words of appreciation for the hard work that those folks are putting in day to day, because there's a lot that is coming out of DCFlex, a lot more to come, but really impressed with what that team is doing. And the last thing I'll say, and Warren, I don't have the ability to move the slide forward, but I do want to end us on the final slide for our DCFlex forum. I hope this was a valuable conversation for those of you who have joined us on the line. I certainly enjoy the opportunity to bring folks on to hear about what we're doing in DCFlex. And so if you are interested, like I said at the top of the hour, in learning more and getting more involved, we are going to be launching this DCFlex forum. So I really encourage you, if you're interested, to email us at dcflexforum@epri.com. Let us know you're interested, and we'll be in touch about ways to get engaged. So with that, we'll leave the line open for a little while. I know there's still some questions in the queue. We'll let folks answer them. We'll give you the chance to continue to submit questions, but just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. We'll let you get on to your next call, but we're looking forward to continuing to engage with you on all these topics related to flexibility for data centers as we move into 2026. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.